The sweltering jungle heat clung to Sergeant Jack Red Wallace like a second skin. His fatigues, already drenched in sweat, seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. He wiped his brow with a trembling hand as he stared at the yawning black hole in the earth. The tunnel entrance was no bigger than a fox's den, but it promised nightmares far beyond anything nature could conjure. "You're up, Red," Lieutenant Harris said, his voice tight with nerves. The younger officer's face was pale, his eyes avoiding the darkness ahead. "Intel says the VC's got a cache in there. Maps, maybe even prisoners." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. He'd heard it all before, the whispered horror stories of men who went into these tunnels and never came back. But orders were orders, and this was his job. Tunnel rats, they called them. They weren't heroes, just men small enough, brave enough, or stupid enough to crawl into hell with a flashlight and a .45. He crouched down and unhooked his gear. Most of it was useless underground. All he needed was his sidearm, a combat knife, a flashlight, and his gut instincts. The other soldiers watched him with a mix of awe and pity. "Careful in there, Red," Private Sanchez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Heard they rigged the last one with snakes." "Snakes, spikes, or Charlie himself," Jack muttered. "Doesn't matter. I'll see you topside." The first thing Jack noticed when he slid into the tunnel was the smell. It was a choking blend of damp earth, rot, and something metallic that clawed at his throat. The air was stifling, wrapping around him like a living thing. He flicked on his flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The walls were lined with crude wooden supports, the dirt packed so tightly it seemed to swallow sound. Every movement felt amplified, the shuffle of his boots, the creak of his belt, the steady thud of his heartbeat. Jack crawled forward, inch by agonizing inch, his body scraping against the walls. He kept his flashlight low, scanning for booby traps. He'd seen them all before. Tripwires, punji stakes, and grenades rigged to collapse the tunnel. But it wasn't just the traps that got to him. It was the silence. The kind that wasn't empty but full, teeming with unseen things. He paused, listening. There was a faint scratching sound ahead, almost like claws on stone. His pulse quickened. "Just a rat," he whispered to himself, though the words felt hollow. His fingers tightened around the grip of his .45. The tunnel curved sharply to the right, and his flashlight beam fell on something that made his blood run cold. A crude drawing was etched into the dirt wall, a stick figure hanging from a tree. Beneath it, a single word was scrawled in smeared white chalk. "Ding. Stop." Jack swallowed hard and pressed on, his mind racing. It wasn't unusual for the Viet Cong to use psychological warfare. They'd leave warnings, sometimes even recordings of screams, to unnerve their enemies. But this felt different. The tunnel seemed to grow narrower, the air heavier. His flashlight flickered, casting jittery shadows that danced like phantoms. Suddenly, the scratching sound grew louder. Jack froze, holding his breath. The noise wasn't coming from ahead, it was behind him. Slowly, he turned his head, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam illuminated a pair of glinting eyes, low to the ground. A rat, he thought, relief washing over him, until it moved. It wasn't a rat. It was too big, its body twisted and wrong. It scuttled into the shadows before he could get a clear look. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. He crawled faster now, his pulse hammering in his ears. The tunnel began to slope downward, the dirt giving way to jagged stone. The air grew colder, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odor. It was unlike anything Jack had smelled before, and it set his teeth on edge. He came to a small chamber, just large enough to crouch in. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. They looked ancient, their edges worn smooth by time. At the center of the chamber lay a pile of bones, human and animal intermingled. Jack's flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw movement among the bones. "This isn't real," he whispered, his voice trembling. But the fear in his chest was all too real. He reached for his radio, desperate to hear another human voice. "This is Red. Do you copy?" "Over." Static crackled in response, broken only by a faint, distorted voice. "Get out." The distorted voice still echoed in Jack's mind as he crouched in the suffocating chamber. His flashlight flickered again, plunging him into brief moments of darkness that felt eternal. The strange symbols on the walls seemed to shift and writhe, as though alive. Jack shook his head, trying to steady his breathing. "Focus, Red," he muttered. "This place is just messing with your head." He glanced back at the pile of bones, his stomach churning. Among the fragments, something gleamed under the weak beam of his flashlight. Crawling closer, he uncovered a rusted dog tag. He rubbed at the grime, revealing the name, Private First Class D. Miller. Jack's chest tightened. Miller had gone missing months ago, presumed dead in an ambush. No one had ever found a body. "Guess I found you," Jack whispered, his voice hollow. He tucked the tag into his pocket and turned to leave the chamber. As he moved, a faint whispering began to fill the air, so soft it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't English. The guttural, lilting tone sent shivers down his spine. Jack froze, straining to locate the source. The whispers seemed to come from all around him, seeping from the very walls. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse. He raised his .45, the cold steel trembling in his hand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Jack stumbled back, his flashlight beam darting wildly. Shadows danced across the walls, taking on twisted shapes. Panic surged through him. He turned and crawled back toward the main tunnel, his movements frantic. As he crawled, the whispers followed him, growing louder with each passing moment. They seemed to take on a mocking tone, repeating his name. "Jack! Jack!" He clenched his teeth, refusing to look back. "It's not real," he told himself. "It's not real." The tunnel narrowed further, forcing Jack to squeeze through on his belly. The rough stone scraped against his arms and legs, leaving raw, bloody streaks. His flashlight beam wavered, and he realized the batteries were dying. "Not now," he muttered, slapping the side of the flashlight. It flickered and stabilized, but the light was dimmer now, casting eerie shadows that seemed to leap toward him. Jack's radio crackled again, breaking through the oppressive whispers. "Red, you need to..." The voice was faint, distorted. Jack grabbed the radio, desperate for a connection. "Harris? Is that you? I'm still down here, over." Static. "Then get out before..." The transmission cut off, leaving only the whispers. Jack's grip tightened on the radio, his knuckles white. He crawled faster, his movements clumsy in his panic. The tunnel began to slope upward, the air growing warmer. Relief surged through him. He was getting closer to the surface. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl that froze him in place. It echoed through the tunnel, resonating deep in his chest. Jack's breath hitched. He turned, his flashlight barely illuminating the darkness behind him. Two glowing eyes stared back at him, unblinking. The glowing eyes were mesmerizing. Two pinpoints of cold, inhuman malice in the suffocating darkness. Jack felt his breath catch in his throat as the low growl deepened, reverberating through the tunnel like a living heartbeat. The creature didn't move, not yet, but Jack could sense its coiled power, the way a predator waits before pouncing. He forced his body to move, even as his mind screamed for him to freeze. Slowly, he brought his flashlight up, the dim beam trembling as it settled on the figure. What he saw made his stomach churn. The creature was humanoid but grotesquely deformed. Its limbs were elongated, fingers tipped with claws that glinted faintly in the flickering light. Its face was a mockery of humanity. Its mouth stretched wide in a grin that revealed uneven teeth, and its eyes, those terrible, unblinking eyes, never left his. Jack's instincts took over. He raised his .45 and fired. The explosion of sound was deafening in the confines of the tunnel, but the creature barely flinched. It let out a high-pitched shriek, the sound grating and unnatural, before scuttling backward into the shadows with unnatural speed. "Jesus Christ," Jack muttered, his voice shaking. He didn't wait to see if it would return. Turning, he crawled as fast as he could, his body scraping against the jagged walls. The whispers had grown louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo his own thoughts. "You'll never escape. You'll never escape." The tunnel began to shift around him. At first, Jack thought it was his fear playing tricks on him, but the walls seemed to pulse, the dirt and stone rippling like water. His flashlight flickered again, the dying light casting fleeting glimpses of movement in the corners of his vision. "Keep moving," he told himself, his voice a desperate mantra. "Just keep moving." He reached another chamber, larger this time. The air was thick and suffocating, carrying a stench that made him gag. The walls were covered in more symbols, but these were different from the ones before. They were crude, drawn hastily in what looked like blood. In the center of the room stood an altar, a slab of stone slick with a dark, viscous substance. Jack's flashlight dimmed further, and he could barely make out the figure of something slumped on the altar. "Miller?" he whispered, stepping closer. The figure didn't move. It was human, or at least it had been. The body was emaciated, the skin stretched tight over bones. Its face was frozen in a rictus of terror, the eyes wide and staring. Jack's stomach lurched, and he turned away, struggling to keep his composure. A sound behind him made him whip around, his .45 raised. The creature was back, its grin wider than before. This time, it didn't hesitate. It lunged at him, its movements impossibly fast. Jack fired again, the recoil jolting his arm, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. The creature slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. Its claws raked across his chest, tearing through fabric and flesh. Jack screamed, the pains searing and immediate. Desperation took hold. Jack reached for his knife, slashing wildly at the creature. The blade connected, slicing through its flesh with a sickening squelch. The creature let out another shriek and recoiled, giving Jack just enough time to scramble to his feet. He didn't think. He ran, stumbling through the tunnel, his blood leaving a trail in the dirt. The whispers were deafening now, a relentless tide of voices that seemed to come from within his own head. Jack's vision blurred, his strength waning. He didn't know how long he'd been running when he saw the faintest glimmer of light ahead. Hope surged within him, giving him the strength to push forward. The light grew brighter, and Jack realized he was nearing the surface. The tunnel opened up, the oppressive darkness giving way to the humid jungle air. He clawed his way out, collapsing onto the ground. The sunlight was blinding, the sounds of the jungle almost surreal after the suffocating silence of the tunnels. But the whispers didn't stop. Jack lay sprawled in the dirt, his chest heaving. The jungle's oppressive heat was a cruel reminder that he was back in the world of the living. Or was he? The whispers that had haunted him in the tunnel were fainter now, but they hadn't disappeared. They clung to him like a second skin, an unrelenting presence that refused to be shaken. He forced himself to sit up, his entire body protesting the movement. His shirt was shredded, his chest a patchwork of claw marks and dried blood. He reached for his radio, his hands trembling. "Red to base. Come in. Over." Static greeted him, followed by a faint garbled response. "Red, is that you? Where are you? Over." Jack let out a shaky breath. "I made it out. I'm topside. Need extraction ASAP. Over." "Copy that. Hold tight, Red. We're sending a team. Over and out." Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Jack's eyes drifted back to the tunnel entrance. The black maw seemed to beckon him, a silent promise that his ordeal wasn't over. He tore his gaze away, focusing instead on the jungle around him. But something was wrong. The air felt too still, the usual cacophony of insects and birds eerily absent. Jack struggled to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. He scanned the tree line, his .45 still clutched in his hand. The whispers grew louder again, a susurrus of voices that seemed to echo from every direction. "You can't leave. You can't leave." "Shut up," Jack growled, his voice breaking. "You're not real." But the jungle disagreed. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any, and the oppressive heat seemed to intensify. Jack stumbled backward, his heart pounding. A figure emerged from the tree line, its movements slow and deliberate. It was Miller. "No," Jack whispered, his mind recoiling. Miller's body was just as he'd seen it in the chamber, emaciated and broken. But his eyes were alive, burning with an unnatural light. He raised a hand, pointing back toward the tunnel. "You brought it back," Miller said, his voice hollow and accusatory. "It's not done with you." Jack shook his head, backing away. "I didn't bring anything. I barely made it out alive." Miller's expression didn't change. "It follows. It always follows." The whispers reached a crescendo, drowning out Jack's frantic breathing. The ground beneath him trembled, and he turned to see the tunnel entrance collapse inward, a plume of dust rising into the air. But even as the tunnel sealed itself, Jack knew it wasn't over. The thing in the dark had marked him, and there was no escaping it. The extraction team arrived minutes later, their voices and movements pulling Jack out of his daze. They loaded him onto a stretcher, their questions going unanswered. Jack stared up at the canopy of trees, the whispers still echoing in his mind. He'd made it out of the tunnel, but he knew, deep down, that the tunnel hadn't let him go. It was 1968, and the jungles of Vietnam were thick with a choking humidity that felt like a living thing. Corporal Danny Ghost Harris wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he prepared to descend into yet another tunnel. At 23, he was already seasoned, but nothing prepared you for what lay in the blackened veins beneath the earth. "Danny, you good?" Sergeant Wallace asked, his voice muffled by the dense canopy above. The older man had a way of masking concern with gruffness, but Danny could hear the worry in his tone. "Yeah, I'm good," Danny replied, though his voice was taut with unspoken fear. He checked his flashlight, his .45 pistol, and his Ka-Bar knife, the only companions he could trust in the claustrophobic hell below. The tunnel entrance yawned before him, a crude hole barely wide enough to squeeze through. It smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like rusted blood. This wasn't just another recon mission. Intel suggested the Viet Cong had been using this network to store supplies and prisoners. As Danny slid into the hole, the jungle sounds faded, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against his ears. The light from above shrank to a pinpoint before vanishing entirely. His flashlight cast an anemic glow on the walls, which seemed to close in the farther he crawled. The air was stale, thick with mildew and something fouler that he didn't want to identify. He inched forward, his breathing loud in the confined space. His mind replayed Wallace's last words before he descended. "Stay sharp. Those bastards are like ghosts down there." The irony wasn't lost on Danny, whose call sign mocked the very thing he feared becoming, a specter haunting these tunnels forever. He froze at the sound of a faint scuttling ahead. Rats, he thought. At least, he hoped they were rats. But the sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint whisper. Danny's grip tightened on his flashlight and pistol. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice bouncing back in distorted echoes. The whispering stopped. For a moment, the silence was complete, save for the thundering of his heartbeat. Then, from the darkness, a single word floated to his ears. "Ghost." Danny's blood turned to ice. He strained his flashlight forward, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive dark. His fingers tightened on the grip of his pistol, his mouth dry as sandpaper. "Identify yourself," he demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of the unknown. There was no response, only the faint scraping of something, or someone, moving deeper into the tunnel. Against every instinct screaming at him to turn back, Danny crawled forward, driven by a mixture of duty and a growing, inexplicable compulsion. The walls seemed to close tighter as he moved. His shoulder scraped against rough stone and the air became thicker, almost liquid. Then his flashlight flickered and died. Panic surged as darkness engulfed him completely, but before he could react, a cold hand brushed his ankle. Danny recoiled with a shout, fumbling to turn his flashlight back on. When the weak beam finally sputtered to life, the tunnel was empty. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. Whatever had touched him was gone, or had never been there. Then, he saw it. A crude drawing etched into the tunnel wall, illuminated in the beam of his light. It depicted a human figure standing in a tunnel, surrounded by smaller, shadowy forms. Beneath it were two words scratched deeply into the earth. "Join us." Danny stared at the etching, the words echoing in his mind like a sinister invitation. He tried to shake it off, but the whispers returned, louder now, coming from every direction. And then, from the corner of his vision, something moved. The whispers surrounded Danny like a living thing, slithering through the darkness. He pressed his back against the tunnel wall, clutching his pistol in one hand and his flashlight in the other. His mind raced as he struggled to control his breathing. The air felt heavier now, like he was inhaling through a wet cloth. "Get a grip, Harris," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. "It's just the dark playing tricks." But even as he spoke, he couldn't ignore the feeling that he wasn't alone. He shuffled forward cautiously, the beam of his flashlight dancing across the rough earthen walls. Every sound was amplified in the oppressive silence, the scrape of his boots, the rustle of his gear, the quickening thud of his heart. And then he saw it, a faint glimmer of light up ahead. Danny hesitated. The light was unnatural, a cold, bluish glow that had no place in a dank subterranean tunnel. It pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of something alive. Against every instinct, he crept closer, drawn by a mix of curiosity and dread. As he approached, the light revealed itself to be emanating from a crude lantern hanging from the tunnel ceiling. The lantern was ancient, its surface encrusted with rust and grime. Inside, a pale flame flickered without a visible fuel source, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Beneath the lantern lay a pile of bones, neatly arranged in a way that could only be deliberate. Skulls grinned up at him, their empty sockets seeming to follow his every move. He crouched down, his flashlight tracing over the macabre display. "What the hell?" Danny whispered, his voice barely audible. The bones were human, that much was clear, but they were marked with strange symbols carved deep into the surface. The symbols were unfamiliar, but they filled him with a sense of primal unease. Suddenly, a voice spoke behind him, low and guttural. "You shouldn't be here." Danny spun around, his pistol raised. The tunnel behind him was empty, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the void. His pulse hammered in his ears as he scanned the shadows, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have spoken. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing back at him. The only response was the faint sound of the whispers returning. Louder now, more insistent. Then, without warning, the lantern's flame flared, bathing the tunnel in blinding blue light. Danny shielded his eyes, but as the light subsided, he saw them, figures emerging from the walls themselves. They were translucent, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke, faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow pits of darkness. They reached for him with skeletal hands, their mouths moving soundlessly in an endless scream. Danny stumbled backward, firing his pistol wildly. The gunshots roared in the confined space, but the bullets passed through the figures without effect. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. "Leave. Join us. Help us." The voices filled his head, each word a nail driven into his sanity. He turned and ran, his flashlight swinging wildly as he crawled through the tunnel at breakneck speed. The air seemed to grow thicker with every step, and the walls pressed closer, as if the earth itself sought to swallow him whole. Just as his lungs screamed for air and his mind teetered on the edge of panic, he burst into a small chamber. The space was barely large enough to stand in, but compared to the suffocating tunnel, it felt like an oasis. Danny collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. His flashlight revealed more symbols carved into the chamber walls, along with crude drawings of human figures surrounded by ghostly shapes. In the center of the chamber lay an object wrapped in dirty cloth. With trembling hands, he unwrapped it, revealing a small metal box. The box was old, its surface scratched and dented, but it was locked tight. On its lid was a single word etched in jagged letters: penance. Danny's gut churned as he stared at the box. Whatever was inside, he knew it wasn't meant to be found. But before he could decide what to do, a voice echoed through the chamber, clear and commanding. "You've gone too far, Ghost." Danny whipped around, his flashlight illuminating the figure of a man standing in the entrance to the chamber. The man wore a tattered Viet Cong uniform, his face gaunt and pale as death. In his hand, he held a knife that glinted in the weak light, and his eyes, they burned with a malevolent fire that made Danny's blood run cold. Danny's finger hovered over the trigger of his pistol, the weapon trembling in his hand. The man in the tattered Viet Cong uniform stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the dirt floor of the chamber. The eerie fire in his eyes illuminated his gaunt features, making him look more like a walking corpse than a living man. "You shouldn't have come," the man rasped. His voice was low and guttural, carrying an otherworldly resonance that sent chills down Danny's spine. Danny steadied himself, his voice cracking as he barked, "Who are you? What do you want?" The man tilted his head, his expression one of amusement mixed with pity. "You are the intruder here," he said, pointing a skeletal finger at the box in Danny's hand. "That does not belong to you." Danny glanced at the box, his gut twisting with a mix of curiosity and dread. "What's in it?" The man's face darkened, and the flickering fire in his eyes flared brighter. "A curse," he hissed, "a punishment for those who disturb the dead. Put it back and leave if you value your life." For a moment, Danny considered obeying. Every instinct screamed at him to drop the box, climb out of the tunnel, and never look back. But something deeper, some insidious compulsion, rooted him in place. "I can't do that," Danny said, his voice firmer now. "If this box is connected to the people who went missing down here, I need to know." I need to stop whatever's happening." The man's lips curled into a grim smile. "You think you can stop this? Foolish boy. This place does not obey your laws or your gods. It belongs to the forgotten, the forsaken." And now, he took another step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It belongs to you." Before Danny could react, the man lunged at him. Danny fired his pistol, the deafening blast reverberating through the chamber. The bullet struck the man square in the chest, but instead of falling, he dissolved into a swirling cloud of ash and smoke. The smoke coiled around Danny like a living thing, seeping into his nose and mouth. He choked and sputtered, clawing at his throat as the acrid taste burned his lungs. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he was dying. But then, just as quickly as it began, the smoke dissipated. Danny collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. When he looked up, the man was gone. The chamber was silent, save for the faint whisper of wind through the tunnels. Danny's hands shook as he picked up the metal box, its weight suddenly feeling unbearable. He turned it over, examining the jagged letters etched into the lid. Penance. The word felt like a brand burned into his mind, a warning he couldn't ignore. As he moved to leave the chamber, a low rumble echoed through the tunnels. The walls trembled, and loose dirt rained down from the ceiling. Danny's heart raced as he realized the tunnel system was shifting, as if alive, rearranging itself to trap him. He crawled back into the narrow passage, the box clutched tightly to his chest. The walls seemed to press closer with every inch, the darkness growing thicker, more suffocating. He could hear the whispers again, louder now, their words clearer. "Don't run, ghost. Stay with us. Pay your penance." Danny bit back a scream, his mind teetering on the edge of panic. He pressed forward, his flashlight flickering as if it too was succumbing to the oppressive atmosphere. Then he saw it. A faint glimmer of light up ahead. He crawled faster, his breath ragged, desperate for escape. As he neared the source, he realized it was the tunnel's exit, the faint glow of daylight filtering through the foliage above. Relief surged through him as he climbed out of the hole, his boots sinking into the muddy jungle floor. The sounds of the jungle returned, a cacophony of chirping insects and distant bird calls. For a moment, he felt the weight of the tunnel lift from his shoulders. But then he noticed the silence. Wallace and the others were gone. The clearing, once bustling with activity, was now eerily empty. The radio, the gear, even the tracks and the dirt, all of it had vanished. Danny stood alone, the metal box still clutched in his hands. The jungle seemed darker now, the trees casting long skeletal shadows. And from somewhere deep within the foliage, a voice whispered his name. Ghost. Danny spun around, his pistol raised, but the jungle around him was empty. The whisper of his name came again, carried on the wind like a taunt. His grip tightened on the metal box, his knuckles white as he scanned the dense foliage for any sign of movement. "Wallace?" he called out, his voice hoarse. "Anyone?" There was no reply. The jungle seemed alive in its silence, each rustle of leaves or distant cry of an animal making his pulse quicken. He could still feel the weight of the tunnel on his chest, the suffocating air lingering in his lungs. The whispers, faint but insistent, tugged at the edges of his mind. He looked down at the box. Its surface was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the jagged letters spelling penance seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He considered tossing it into the undergrowth, leaving it behind and running. But something stopped him. A deep, gnawing certainty that it wouldn't let him go. The whispers grew louder, shifting into words that chilled him to the bone. Open it, face it, accept it. Danny dropped to his knees, sweat pouring down his face as he fought the compulsion rising within him. He wanted to scream, to hurl the box into the jungle and never look back, but his hands moved against his will. Slowly, almost reverently, he began to pry the lid open. The moment the box cracked, a blinding light erupted from within. Danny cried out, shielding his eyes as the light engulfed him. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay, and the whispers became a cacophony of screams. When the light subsided, Danny found himself somewhere else entirely. The jungle was gone, replaced by a vast, desolate landscape. The sky was an ashen gray, and the ground beneath him was cracked and dry, littered with bones. A chill ran through him as he realized the bones stretched out in every direction, a sea of the dead as far as the eye could see. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. A figure emerged from the haze, the same gaunt man in the tattered Viet Cong uniform. But now his form was clearer, his features sharper. He wasn't just pale, he was a corpse, his skin clinging tightly to his bones, his eyes burning with that same unnatural fire. "This is the cost of war," the man said, his voice echoing across the barren wasteland. "Every life taken, every soul forgotten, they linger here, waiting for their reckoning." Danny shook his head, stepping back. "I didn't choose this. I was following orders." The man smiled grimly. "And so were we. But the dead care little for excuses. They demand justice. They demand penance." The ground beneath Danny shifted, and he stumbled as skeletal hands burst from the earth, grasping at his legs. He screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the hands were relentless, pulling him down inch by inch. "Please," Danny begged, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The man knelt before him, his fiery eyes locking onto Danny's. "You took from us. Now you must give back." With a surge of desperation, Danny grabbed the metal box and thrust it toward the man. Take it, and leave me alone." The man's expression darkened, and he shook his head. "It's not that simple. The box is merely a key. The penance is yours to bear." The skeletal hands pulled Danny down further, the earth swallowing him like quicksand. The whispers rose into a deafening roar, voices overlapping in a symphony of torment. Just as the darkness consumed him, Danny heard one final word, spoken with chilling clarity. "Ghost." Danny awoke with a start, gasping for air. He was back in the jungle, lying on the ground near the tunnel entrance. The box was gone, and so was any sign of the strange figure or the desolate wasteland. But something was different. The jungle felt heavier, darker, as if it too had been changed by what had transpired. And then Danny realized the truth. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were quieter now, buried beneath the sounds of the jungle, but they were still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He stood shakily, his body aching as he stumbled back toward his unit's camp. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, or if they were even still there. All he knew was that the box, the tunnel, and the whispers had marked him in a way that could never be undone. As he moved through the jungle, the whispers followed, a constant reminder of what he had seen and what he had become. Danny Ghost Harris was no longer just a soldier. He was a keeper of secrets, a bearer of penance, and the dead would never let him forget. The jungle buzzed with an oppressive heat, alive with the unrelenting hum of insects and the distant cry of some unknown creature. Private First Class Nate Palmer adjusted his helmet, his fingers trembling slightly as he glanced at the others in his unit. The tunnel rats were a special breed, chosen not by their rank or skill, but often by their size and the grim reality that no one else wanted the job. At barely 5'6", Nate had been deemed perfect for the task. "Palmer, you're up," barked Staff Sergeant Boyd, his voice rough like gravel. Boyd spat a stream of tobacco juice into the undergrowth as he leaned against a nearby tree. The rest of the squad looked away, avoiding Nate's gaze. No one wanted to lock eyes with a man who might not come back. Nate crouched beside the dark, yawning hole in the earth. Its entrance was barely wide enough for his shoulders, a gaping maw leading into the black. The Viet Cong tunnels were legendary, labyrinths of death and cunning, filled with booby traps, snipers, and a suffocating sense of dread. He felt the weight of the flashlight and the .45 pistol strapped to his hip. They weren't much comfort. "Think of it as a game," muttered Private Garcia, trying to lighten the mood. "You know, like hide and seek." Nate forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked over his shoulder at Garcia. "Yeah, except the losers don't get another round." The first few feet of the tunnel were tight, forcing Nate onto his belly. The air was stale and damp, the earthy walls pressing against his ribs. Each inch forward seemed to stretch time, his heartbeat a deafening drum in his ears. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing twisting roots and scattered debris. Old boots, broken tools, and sometimes things worse than that. A faint sound echoed ahead, like a whisper carried on the breeze. Nate froze, his breath catching in his throat. He strained his ears, hoping it was just the wind, but the noise came again, closer this time. It was a soft scratching, like claws against stone. "Palmer, Report, Boyd's voice crackled faintly over the radio clipped to Nate's belt. Nate fumbled for the radio, his voice shaking. Nothing yet, Sarge. Just... The scratching grew louder, cutting him off. He aimed his flashlight ahead, the beam flickering for a moment before stabilizing. And then he saw it. A single hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from the shadows. Nate's breath hitched as the flashlight's beam quivered over the outstretched hand. For a moment, he was frozen, unable to reconcile what he was seeing. The hand was eerily still, its long fingers curled in an almost beckoning gesture. It was too clean, too pale, as though untouched by the grime of the tunnels. His instincts screamed at him to back away, but his training demanded he investigate. "Palmer, what's your status?" Boyd's voice snapped him back to the moment. He swallowed hard and clicked the radio. "I've got something here. Looks like a body." His voice was steadier than he expected, though his hands shook uncontrollably. Sliding forward on his stomach, Nate inched closer to the outstretched hand. The narrow tunnel made every movement deliberate, every scrape of his gear against the walls amplified in the suffocating silence. As he moved the flashlight, the beam revealed more. An arm connected to a body slumped awkwardly against the wall, its face turned away. He exhaled, relief washing over him. It was just a corpse, probably a dead Viet Cong soldier, left behind in the chaos. But as the light lingered on the body, his relief soured. The flesh was pristine, unmarked by wounds or decay. "Garcia, this is messed up," Nate muttered into the radio. "Looks like he just sat down and died." "You're probably overthinking it, man," Garcia replied, his voice tinny and distant. "Just a dead guy. Keep moving." But Nate couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The body's posture, the way it seemed almost posed. He reached out with trembling fingers and touched the arm. It was ice cold, the texture of the skin unnervingly smooth like wax. Then the body moved. A sudden convulsion of limbs sent Nate scrambling back, his head slamming against the low ceiling of the tunnel. The corpse twisted unnaturally, its head snapping around to face him. Empty eye sockets stared into Nate's soul, and a gaping mouth opened in a silent scream. "Shit! Shit!" Nate shouted, kicking frantically to put distance between him and the impossible figure. His flashlight clattered to the ground, casting wild shadows on the walls. "Nate, what's going on? Report." Boyd's voice barked over the radio. He couldn't answer. The thing was crawling toward him now, its movements jerky and spasmodic. It dragged itself forward with its hands, its legs limp and useless behind it. Nate fumbled for his pistol, his fingers slipping on the grip. When the .45 finally cleared its holster, he fired. The shot was deafening in the confined space, and the recoil jarred his arm. The bullet struck the figure square in the chest, but it didn't stop. "Stay back!" Nate screamed, firing again and again. Each shot echoed louder than the last. The tunnel filling with acrid smoke and the metallic scent of gunpowder. The thing flinched with each impact but kept advancing, its lifeless eyes fixed on him. Desperate, Nate grabbed the flashlight and swung it wildly. The beam caught the thing's face, and for a moment it recoiled, hissing like an animal. The light, it seemed to hurt it. Seizing the moment, Nate scrambled backward, his heart pounding like a war drum. He kept the flashlight trained on the figure as he retreated, its hisses fading into the darkness. "Palmer, get out of there, now!" Boyd's voice was a lifeline, pulling him back from the brink. "I'm coming up," Nate shouted, his voice cracking. He didn't care about protocol anymore. Whatever this mission was, it wasn't worth his life or his sanity. But as he turned to make his way back, a chilling thought rooted him in place. What if there were more of them? Nate moved faster than he thought possible, his elbows and knees scraping against the jagged tunnel floor. The pale figure's hisses faded behind him, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every scrape of his gear, every puff of stale air, felt like an impending attack. "Palmer, where the hell are you?" Boyd's voice snapped through the radio. Nate grabbed the device, his breath ragged. "I'm coming back. Something's down here, Sarge. Something not human." "Cut the crap, soldier. Focus and return to the surface," Boyd growled. But Nate couldn't respond. As he crawled, the tunnel seemed to stretch and shift, the walls closing in like a living thing. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced in his peripheral vision. Each time the light dimmed, he swore he saw movement, figures darting just out of reach, their forms melting into the darkness. He came to a fork in the tunnel, two identical passages stretching into the void. Nate hesitated, his instincts screaming that neither path was safe. He clicked the radio again. "Sarge, the tunnel's splitting. Which way do I go?" Static crackled back at him. Then, faintly, "Follow the left." Nate frowned. The voice didn't sound like Boyd. It was softer, almost melodic, like a whisper spoken directly into his ear. His flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, the pale figure from before appeared at the edge of the beam, its eyeless sockets staring. Without thinking, Nate bolted down the left tunnel, his heart pounding. The passage seemed narrower here, the air colder. He felt the damp walls brushing against his shoulders, the roots tangling in his hair. A sudden noise stopped him in his tracks, a soft, wet squelching, like something being dragged. He pressed himself against the wall, his flashlight off, and held his breath. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was just beyond the curve ahead. And then, silence. Nate switched on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. The tunnel ahead was empty, but the floor was wet, slick with a dark liquid. Blood. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice trembling. A voice answered him, low and guttural, from somewhere ahead. "Why did you come here?" Nate's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't human, yet it spoke clearly, with an edge of malice. He raised his pistol, his hands shaking. "Who's there? Show yourself." The shadows shifted, and a figure stepped into the light. It was a man, or at least it had been. His uniform was American, but his face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over hollow cheekbones. His eyes glowed faintly, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "You shouldn't be here," the figure rasped. "They don't like visitors." "Who's they?" Nate demanded, his finger tightening on the trigger. The man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "The ones who own the earth. The ones who feed." Before Nate could react, the man lunged, impossibly fast, his claw-like hands reaching for him. Nate fired, the shot echoing deafeningly in the tunnel. The figure recoiled, hissing like the creature before, but didn't fall. Panicking, Nate turned and ran, the sound of pursuit echoing behind him. The tunnel seemed to twist and warp, leading him deeper instead of back to the surface. He tripped over something, a set of bones, human bones, long since picked clean. "Come back," the voice called, mocking him. "You can't leave." Nate crawled through the narrowest part of the tunnel, his gear snagging on roots and debris. His lungs burned, and his vision blurred from lack of oxygen. The flashlight flickered again, then died, plunging him into darkness. He felt the earth around him shift, the walls pressing closer. He clawed at the dirt, desperate to keep moving, but the tunnel seemed to collapse around him. And then, from the suffocating darkness, he heard it again. That soft scratching, growing louder, coming from every direction. Nate's body screamed for air as he crawled through the unyielding darkness. His fingers dug into the damp earth, and his ears were filled with the horrifying cacophony of the scratching, a maddening symphony that grew louder with every breath. He felt the weight of the earth around him, a crushing sense of claustrophobia that threatened to break his mind. "Stay focused, Nate," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "One crawl at a time, just keep moving." But the tunnel had changed. It was no longer a straight passage but a twisting labyrinth, the walls narrowing and widening in unnatural ways. The air grew colder with each passing moment, and Nate could feel a faint vibration in the ground, like the heartbeat of something massive and alive. "Palmer, do you copy?" Boyd's voice crackled faintly through the radio. Nate snatched at the device, hope flaring in his chest. "Sarge, I'm stuck down here. There's something in these tunnels. I don't know how to get back." "Stay put, soldier. We're sending someone in to get you." Boyd barked, but his voice was distorted, cutting in and out. Nate clutched the radio like a lifeline, but before he could respond, the scratching intensified, now accompanied by a low guttural growl. He froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. The sound wasn't just ahead of him, it was behind him, above him, surrounding him. And then he saw them. Dozens of glowing eyes blinked to life in the darkness, their eerie light casting faint shadows on the tunnel walls. Shapes emerged, humanoid but wrong, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They crawled on all fours, their pale, hairless bodies glistening in the dim light of their eyes. "Oh God," Nate whispered, his voice barely audible. The creatures moved closer, their mouths opening to reveal rows of jagged teeth. They didn't hiss or growl. They simply stared at him, their expressions unreadable but filled with malice. Nate fumbled for his pistol, his fingers slipping on the grip as the first creature lunged. He fired blindly, the muzzle flash illuminating the tunnel in strobe-like bursts. The bullet struck one of the creatures and it let out a bone-chilling scream before collapsing. But the others didn't flinch. "No. Stay back," Nate yelled, firing again and again until the chamber clicked empty. The creatures swarmed, their clawed hands grabbing at him. He kicked and thrashed, his screams echoing through the tunnels. They didn't tear him apart as he expected. Instead, they dragged him deeper into the earth, their glowing eyes the only light in the suffocating darkness. Nate lost track of time as they carried him through the labyrinth. He felt the walls close in, the air growing colder and thinner. His flashlight and radio were ripped away, leaving him with nothing but the whispers of the creatures and the oppressive weight of the earth. They stopped suddenly, dropping him onto the cold, hard floor of a cavern. Nate's eyes adjusted to the faint glow emanating from the walls, a sickly green light that revealed the horrifying truth. The cavern was massive, its ceiling lost in shadows. The walls were lined with hundreds of bodies, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Some were decomposed, while others looked as though they had died moments ago. At the center of the cavern stood a massive, pulsing structure, like a twisted, organic altar. Nate crawled backward, his mind reeling. The creatures surrounded him, their glowing eyes fixed on the altar. From its surface, a grotesque form began to rise, its shape constantly shifting, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. A voice filled the cavern, deep and resonant, vibrating through Nate's bones. "You have entered our domain, little rat, and now you will serve." Nate tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creatures moved closer, their claws reaching for him. He struggled, his mind shattering under the weight of the impossible. And then the light went out. In the days that followed, Boyd and the rest of the squad searched for Nate, but they found no trace of him. The tunnel entrance collapsed, sealing whatever horrors lay beneath. Back at camp, Garcia swore he heard Nate's voice on the radio, faint and distorted, whispering a single phrase, "They're still hungry."